The 2022 midterms were a nightmare for Republicans. Even with record high inflation, a bad economy, and a fairly unpopular president, the Republican Party failed to take control of the Senate and only eked out a small majority in the House. Now, when a political party underperforms, blame has to go somewhere, and Kevin McCarthy's 36-year career in politics was a perfect place to litigate the situation. So let's set up the battlefield. On one side, we have the far-right faction of the party. These Republicans are defined by their loyalty to Trump and represent a constituency that has a very high opinion of the 45th president. These are the people that come to mind when you think of culture war. Ron DeSantis would probably be the most high-profile example of this set of the GOP outside of Donald Trump himself, but Matt Gaetz and Marjorie Taylor Greene are, in my opinion, the most entertaining and played a major role in the 2022 speaker elections. On the other side, we have the moderate establishment wing of the party. This group of people are willing to compromise on social issues and in many cases might even hold liberal positions on things like gay marriage, abortion, etc., but are not willing to compromise on conservative economic policy. They are largely representatives of big business interests and are what comes to mind when you think of these big super PACs and large donors. Their perceived weakness on many conservative social priorities often earns them the distinction of RINO, R-I-N-O, or Republican in name only. As an example, you can take politicians like Utah Senator Mitt Romney, recently retired, current Republican presidential candidate Nikki Haley, and to a certain extent the tragic hero of our tale, Kevin McCarthy. The thing that you need to know about these two groups of Republicans is that they absolutely hate each other. If you think there's a lot of infighting in the Democratic Party, it's nothing like what's happening in the GOP. It's just that the GOP happens to be better at putting a unified front forward, at least most of the time. I think Matt Gaetz actually holds personal disgust and animosity towards Kevin McCarthy, who he sees as a soulless politician who doesn't really believe in anything and isn't willing to take on the unpopular social conservative priorities with the rest of the far right. But through the fog of war, what became abundantly clear in the aftermath of the 2022 midterm elections was that the candidates that aligned themselves closely to Trump did a lot worse than Republicans that were trying to put a little bit of distance between themselves and the far right. The state of Georgia would be a perfect encapsulation of this dynamic. While Republican Brian Kemp handily won the governorship over Stacey Abrams, former NFL running back Herschel Walker, a person who was given an endorsement by Trump, was tackled before he could reach a majority of the vote. The Speaker of the House is selected each session by a simple majority, with all members of the chamber allowed one vote. This means that AOC has as much say over who gets to lead the Republican Party as any normal Republican politician. And because the Republicans were left with a razor-thin 9-seat majority in the House after the elections, Kevin McCarthy wasn't going to have that much wiggle room in order to win a majority. He basically had to hold all the Republicans. If the midterms had played out any better for the Republicans, the establishment faction of the Republican Party would have as much leverage in the world to try to get Kevin McCarthy elected. But because Republicans weren't able to pick up enough seats in the midterms, the hardliners who did end up winning their seats had just enough power to make a big mess out of the situation. And so on January 3rd, the first ballot to elect Kevin McCarthy as Speaker of the House failed to receive a majority as 19 Republicans joined the Democrats in voting for literally anyone else. Now, if you're Kevin McCarthy, that's pretty embarrassing, but the situation wasn't completely unworkable, so they went back to their back rooms and started, making deals, the art of the deal. Kevin McCarthy started with some surface-level concessions. He agreed to change the rules to make it possible for a lone representative to call a motion to vacate Kevin McCarthy from the speaker role. Absolutely nothing could go wrong. MAGA Republicans were also promised a vote on Social Security and a border security bill. But these deals weren't going to be enough to win over key holdouts, and this is when the real blood starts to get spilled. The first real concession given up by Kevin McCarthy's camp is the seat on the coveted House Rules Committee. And shortly after, chair positions on other key committees started to become up for grabs. The amount that Kevin McCarthy had to give up in these negotiations should not go understated. Not only did he have to give up key committee positions to his political rivals, but he did so by withholding these positions from his political allies, weakening his command over the party generally. But Matt Gaetz and his crew of wacky dudes weren't satisfied with this humiliation and wanted to draw out even more blood from Kevin McCarthy even after he was elected Speaker. On September 30th of this year, Kevin McCarthy would pass a federal budget bill with the support of 209 Democrats in order to prevent a government shutdown. Cavorting with the enemy in this sense was seen as a mortal sin by Gaetz and the rest of the far right, and shortly after, they voted to remove Kevin McCarthy from the speakership. So what did Kevin McCarthy do? I don't know, he kept the government running? There was absolutely no reason to move this guy out of the way. I guess the only reason that they gave was he wasn't MAGA enough. And after a little bit more trolling, the Republicans finally ended up electing Mike Johnson as Speaker of the House, who is a far-right extremist. And with another looming shutdown, it's not clear whether or not he's going to bring all the crazies to the table in order to get a deal done. We'll see how it plays out, but right now it's not looking that great. I want you to put yourself in the shoes of Kevin McCarthy and the Republican establishment for a second and think about the sheer injustice of this situation. This fringe, radical segment of your party loses the election for you and then goes on to hold the rest of the party hostage and win concession after concession. So what can we take away from this episode as an outside observer? If I was a less sophisticated political thinker, I would just chalk this up to toxic partisanship. The argument that most pundits make about the modern Republican Party is that the primary elections are set up in such a way that cause the very motivated far-right elements of the Republican Party to be overrepresented. This makes the candidates that come out of these primaries less electable in a general election and a headache for establishment Republicans when they actually do find their way to Washington. And there is definitely some truth to that, and in fact, this is basically the working theory of the Democrats who fund radical primary candidates that they think they will have an easier time in beating. But this isn't the full story. Again, establishment Republicans need the far right as much as they hate them. The economic policy of the Republican Party isn't only bad, but it's utterly inspiring as an issue to get people out to the polls. There just simply aren't enough people in this country who are getting fired up about corporate tax cuts and austerity politics. And because neoliberal economic policies are the only priorities that establishment Republicans have, they need something else to fill this void. And so this is where the far right culture warriors come in. They provide the soul of the modern Republican Party. So let's go back in history and examine the conception of that soul, to steal a Christian turn of phrase. So we all know the Watergate story. 5 men snuck into the Democratic National Committee offices to try to steal documents in an attempt to help Richard Nixon's 1976 presidential campaign. A couple of Senate testimonies later, Nixon was threatened with impeachment and removal from office, so he decided to do the noble thing and simply resign. But as leaders fall, a power vacuum is created. Gerald Ford, the vice president who took over after Nixon's resignation, was immediately controversial. By the time the Republican Party had to choose a presidential nominee for the 76 election, the conservatives, moderates, and the liberals of the party were ready to fight the next battle over the war for the soul of their party. It's hard to believe now, but the word conservative wasn't always synonymous with the Republican Party. If we jump back to 1963, there were 3 main factions of Republicans: conservatives, moderates, and liberals. The main disagreement between these factions were how they were going to handle a political climate that was defined by the New Deal era as well as civil rights. Remember, this is the first half of the 60s. Social Security, public infrastructure investment, and civil rights were in the air. Smells like communism. And speaking of communism, the extremely popular President Kennedy was still sitting in the White House. At least for about 15 more minutes. The Republican Party was also in a really difficult place more broadly. After the dominance of FDR, American politics shifted significantly to the left, leaving Republicans in a bit of an identity crisis. Even the only Republican president between the years 32 and 68, Dwight D. Eisenhower, would probably be considered more progressive than half of the current Democratic Party, and at least as progressive as Joe Biden. Eisenhower was pro-union and was responsible for one of the biggest public works projects in American history. And before you call me out on it, I know that the implementation of the national highway system created and exacerbated a lot of the racial divisions in this country, but the intention of public infrastructure investment is notable, at least for understanding the ideological makeup of Republicans in the 50s. Again, today, no Republicans advocating for public works. So by the time the 1964 presidential primaries rolled around, the Republican Party was doing a lot of soul searching, and people had very different ideas about how to move the party forward. In the primary, the party faced a choice between conservative bulwark Barry Goldwater and Nelson Rockefeller, yes, related to that Rockefeller, the dirty big city liberal. So-called liberal Republicans were usually from big northern cities and were willing to compromise on a lot of different social issues, including civil rights. Their constituency was mostly comprised of business interests in those cities, and thus were mostly concerned with economic policy over pretty much everything else. On the other side of this divide, you had conservative Republicans who were becoming increasingly uncomfortable with the social progress that was taking place in a society and stood firmly against any civil rights legislation. The divide between these groups were not just ideological or a difference in policy focus, it was deeply cultural. These were deeply cultural differences. In the political circles that shaped Goldwater, there was a deep suspicion of politicians like Nelson Rockefeller. At the conservative grassroots level of the Republican Party, Nelson Rockefeller was equated with the perceived moral degeneracy of New York, the city that his grandfather helped define. While Barry Goldwater wasn't necessarily a classic Southern gentleman, he was about as close as somebody from Arizona could have been. There was also an obvious class element to the dichotomy between Rockefeller and Goldwater. Goldwater was the son of a humble grocery store owner. He wasn't educated in university, instead starting his career with the military, eventually earning the title of Major General in the Air Force. Even though Barry Goldwater wasn't university smart, he leveraged his strengths to become a successful military leader. Quite a beautiful American story if you're a Republican. Rockefeller, on the other hand, he was literally a Rockefeller. The Ivy League Dartmouth College is where he got his degree, and he must have been an outstanding student because he landed a job at Chase National Bank right out of college. Wonder how that happened. Going into the Republican National Committee, everybody pretty much knew that the nominee was going to be Goldwater. But the liberal wing of the party, represented by Rockefeller, wasn't necessarily going out without a bit of trolling, to say the least. Some senator goes on to introduce an amendment to the GOP platform that explicitly denounces the Communist Party, the KKK, as well as the John Birch Society, which was and still is an anti-communist organization that Barry Goldwater and his delegates were largely sympathetic to. The John Birch Society is a group of people who are so crazy that they believe that Eisenhower was a communist sleeper agent. Republican President Eisenhower. The goal of this amendment was basically to embarrass the conservative coalition, who, let's be honest, didn't really want to disavow the KKK and definitely didn't want to disavow their buddies at the controversial John Birch Society. Rockefeller goes on stage to defend this proposal. I'll play for you the clip, and I want you to listen for the cheers that are coming from the floor of the convention where the delegates are sitting, as well as the boos that are coming from the upper bowl where the grassroots supporters are seated. I don't know if you could hear the difference between the cheers and the boos, and I don't know if you want to take my word for it. So here's a first-hand account of the Republican Party official who was there that evening, and this is what he has to say.
Cliff White, the campaign manager for Goldwater, his trailer outside the hall pushed a button which enabled him to communicate instantly with, I think, 15 positions on the floor. And he said, "Don't have our delegates booing Governor Rockefeller." He thought that it was just in bad taste, and after all, Rockefeller was defeated anyway in terms of the convention. But they said, "We're not booing. Our delegates are sitting perfectly still here. It's the stands. It's the crowds up in the stands that nobody was controlling who were doing the booing." And I think that's true. There were an awful lot of Goldwater people out there, no question about it.
Even today, almost 60 years since the Civil Rights Act, Barry Goldwater would be considered a far-right radical. He equated Social Security to communism, was vehemently opposed to civil rights on the basis of states' rights, and was prepared to invade any country that had a whiff of communism brewing in it. He was also an ardent supporter of so-called family values and individualism. Listening to that description might give you an impression that Goldwater was a hardcore person. But again, while his politics were certainly hardline, he was actually rather muted as a person. He didn't have a very large personality. Even as a college dropout, Goldwater's political perspective was shaped by an almost academic detachment from the issues that he took positions on. Even without any formal training in nonfiction writing, Goldwater would write a pivotal book in the history of conservative thought. Just to put this book into a little bit of context, some people place this work with the likes of Edmund Burke's revolutionary writings in 1790 and Dante's De Monarchia in 1313. While these comparisons might be a little bit hyperbolic, if these two books are defenses against progress in the 1700s and 1300s respectively, the conscience of a conservative, at least in my mind, is the same warning against progress in Goldwater's own socio-cultural moment. And just like writers who came before him, Goldwater would make an appeal to process as laid out by the current status quo. In his book, Goldwater would revive basically the oldest lie in American history. It's called states' rights. Even though his name is synonymous with the last stand against segregation, Goldwater's personal thoughts on civil rights were actually quite complicated. When he took over his father's business in 1930, he became one of the first people to allow both black and white Americans to both work and shop at his store. He was a lifelong member of the NAACP and helped to form the Arizona chapter. He was also an advocate for integrating the armed forces all the way back to 1946, 6 years before Eisenhower would make this standard operating procedure. My impression of Goldwater is someone who was sincere in his convictions. He was somebody who really believed the states' right line. And Reverend Martin Luther King actually agreed with me, and he had this to say about Goldwater. While himself not a racist, Goldwater articulates a philosophy that gives aid and comfort to racists. Again, that's pretty much how I see it. He didn't seem like a bigoted person in his personal life, for what that's worth. So if you need somebody to blame for the people in your first year philosophy class who identify as libertarians and endlessly play devil's advocate, Barry Goldwater's your guy. So Goldwater believed in civil rights in the abstract, but was so ideologically committed to the idea of small government conservatism that in practice he stood in opposition to the civil rights movement. But at the end of the day, it doesn't really matter how he personally felt about black people, right? What matters is that he stood in the way of the political liberation of black Americans and pioneered a lot of the language that would be used to stand in the way of progress, both racially and on other social issues for many years to come. But as of 1964, Goldwater was about 16 years too far ahead of his time. And what he started wasn't able to be put back in the box so easily, and is considered the genesis of the modern conservative movement. But for the time being, the political reality was not ready for a Barry Goldwater, and he was defeated at the hands of Lyndon B. Johnson in a very stunning way. Goldwater would lose every state except for his own, as well as the belt of southern states, which all voted on the single issue of segregation. Again, he was the only pro-segregation candidate. So for the time being, the conservatives of the Republican Party would have to sit on the sidelines, but that did not stop them from plotting their comeback. Most conservatives in the Republican Party were actually young people who took a sort of adversarial stance to their peers who spent the 60s indulging in all the decadencies that the hippie movement had to offer. While young conservatives were excited about Barry Goldwater in the 1964 election, Goldwater was actually quite a reluctant face for the movement. He knew that the results of the 1964 election were basically inevitable, especially given the popularity of Kennedy and his heir apparent, LBJ. He was only convinced to put himself out there because he saw a lot of excitement out of young conservatives. And it actually took a lot of convincing on the part of young conservatives, who started the Draft Goldwater movement as a sort of pressure campaign to get him to run. And obviously it ended up working, but in the back of Barry Goldwater's mind, he always knew that he was going to sort of be a martyr. And after the 1964 election, they would have their martyr, but what they really needed moving forward was a leader who was as enthusiastic about it as they were. Enter Ronald Reagan. Ronald Reagan would step into national politics for the first time to run for the Republican nomination in 1968. In this race, the same basic dynamics from 4 years ago would end up playing out. Ronald Reagan would be cast as a conservative, Richard Nixon would make his comeback to play the moderate, and our friend Nelson Rockefeller would reprise his role as the big business liberal. This time, however, conservatives would not be as successful because Republican voters viewed them as a bit of a liability, especially given the electoral embarrassment that was the 1964 election with Barry Goldwater. And so that basically brings us full circle to everybody's favorite jar in a head, President Richard Nixon. But after Gerald Ford assumed the presidency in '74, he immediately pardoned Richard Nixon and took our good friend Nelson Rockefeller on as vice president. Now, if you wanted to upset every faction of your party all at once, these two actions were a pretty quick way of doing that. But, what else can you expect from a U of M grad? For pretty obvious reasons, liberal Republicans weren't really happy about the fact that Ford let Nixon escape prosecution for his alleged, at the time, orchestration of the Watergate plot. It was also really bad optics for the party, making it seem like Nixon had some sort of backroom deal with Ford. And from the conservative perspective, folks were also livid about the appointment of their arch nemesis Nelson Rockefeller. The way that the conservatives saw it, some guy who wasn't even elected by the party or the broader American public in general was able to put a twice failed presidential candidate into a key position of power without their consent. Whether intentional or not, the conservatives saw this as a massive middle finger to their movement, and by the time the 1976 convention rolled around, they were ready to let Ford hear about it. But even with a deeply unpopular Republican incumbent, the conservative Republicans failed in their bid to get Ronald Reagan the nomination, coming just 43 delegates short. Carter would go on to defeat Gerald Ford in a pretty close election, and the growing conservative movement in the Republican primary would feel vindicated by result. The attitude at the time was hashtag Ronald Reagan would have won. So we can imagine here a conservative movement that is waiting to explode. If Gerald Ford's victory over Reagan fills up the proverbial powder keg, his defeat to Jimmy Carter is the ticking time bomb that would shoot Reagan and his movement to heights conservatives themselves couldn't have even imagined. But before we get into the demise of Jimmy Carter's presidency and the ascendancy of the Reagan right, we have to talk about the people who continued to stack powder as the clock ticked away. While it may seem surprising now, during the 1960s, the conservatives were seen as a fringe movement that was way outside of mainstream politics. The groups most closely associated with the movement were the KKK, a bunch of the whitest kids you know, and the John Birch Society, who again thought that Eisenhower was a communist sleeper agent. Not necessarily the most intellectually sophisticated group of people. The general understanding within the conservative movement was that they were going to need to find a way to get better institutional support and representation. U.S. conservatism has always been a populist movement, a movement that harnesses strong yet vague feelings of people who are not typically interested in politics. As a result, when organizing for conservatism, or any populist movement for that matter, you find yourself in a difficult situation. On one hand, you need to keep the grassroots supporters happy to keep their donations flowing, but you also need to have at least a little bit of institutional financial backing to keep the advocacy machine moving. So in the 1970s, the goal for the conservative movement was to gain that institutional support from capitalist interests. And because they were associated with very fringe and quite frankly stupid segments of American politics, this would be quite the uphill battle. Essentially, the conservative movement needed to get smart. This is the story about how they did that. When attempting to describe a reactionary backlash, there's a tendency to put forward certain narratives about how people are pulled into these movements. Some of these narratives are useful and others not so much. If I was a better writer, perhaps I could avoid using these narratives, but as of right now, please keep an open mind and be patient with me. So the best way to understand the conservative backlash of the 1970s is to look at it from their perspective and focus on the socio-cultural environment that white Christians suddenly found themselves in the 1960s. 5 social issues define the political and cultural moment as we head into the 70s. These issues are Roe v. Wade, the Equal Rights Amendment, or ERA, Black civil rights, evangelical anxiety over family values, and LGBTQ issues. While these issues are interconnected, it is valuable to separate them out individually because they were spearheaded by different figures and touched upon unique corners of the American public. The best place to start out chronologically would probably be January 22nd, 1973, when the Supreme Court decided in favor of a woman's right to access abortion care as a result of the now controversial Roe v. Wade decision. Most people believe that this decision immediately riled up the white Christian population that saw the decision as an existential threat to the country and the religious values that they ascribe to it. And while this makes sense and is sort of believed automatically by everyone who hears it, it's not completely true. And the narrative exists because it legitimizes a certain legal perspective about the decision that is actually quite conservative in nature. UC Davis legal historian and law professor Mary Ziegler is one of the leading scholars on the politics and legal theory surrounding the Roe decision. She writes, "Scholars from across the ideological spectrum have related how Roe helped to entrench the ideological positions held by those on either side of the abortion issue, precluding any form of productive compromise. This criticism has profound legal consequences, serving both as a justification for overruling Roe as well as a case study of the benefits of varying interpretive methods." Ziegler calls this interpretation the beyond backlash theory of the decision, and it is posited both by conservatives who make accusations of judicial activism as well as some of the loudest pro-choice advocates, including the legendary Ruth Bader Ginsburg. RGB famously said that, "My criticism of Roe is that it seems to have stopped the momentum on the side of change." But even on a primary examination, this simple narrative of a backlash caused directly by the decision doesn't really hold up. Other than maybe Phyllis Schlafly, famous for the Stop ERA or the Equal Rights Amendment movement, there was a lag between the decision and when the institutional infrastructure to oppose the Roe v. Wade decision was actually set up. Anita Bryant's crusade against gay rights was set up in 1977. Jerry Falwell's moral majority was founded in 1979, and conservative preacher and activist Pat Robertson started his Christian Broadcasting Network in 1977. Even Schlafly's Stop ERA crusade wasn't necessarily a reaction to Roe, but was instead a long-standing anti-feminist movement that goes back to her work with the Goldwater campaign in 1964. So there was about a 4-year lag between the decision and the organizations that sprouted up to oppose it. We'll get back to these organizations, but it's also instructive to look at how the pro-life/pro-choice debate looked completely different before the Roe decision. As Zegler points out, before Roe, the debate around abortion was essentially a granular fight within second-wave feminism. Pro-choice advocates in the late 60s and early 70s were much more progressive compared to their modern-day counterparts and took a much more holistic, quote, protecting women and the unborn approach. And on the organizational level, pro-lifers advocated for sexual education as well as accessible birth control and contraception. These pro-lifers were much more concerned with typical second-wave issues, including protections against pregnancy discrimination in the workplace and affordable childcare. ACCL activists like Marjorie Mecklenburg would work very closely with national pro-choice organizations like the Reproductive Rights Network, R2N2, and the Committee for Abortion Rights and Against Sterilization Abuse to fight for these legislative priorities. For early pro-life activists, their activism was concerned with improving the material conditions of women and focusing on giving them the true freedom, their words, to have control over their reproductive destinies. In the current political environment, this political perspective is somewhat reflected in college groups like Students for Life. But even that comparison is actually pretty generous to their perspective, given that they are usually all too willing to align themselves with economically conservative political groups who aren't advocating for material women's issues. There isn't really any contemporary equivalent to groups like the ACCL. There is an argument to be made that the alliance between pro-choice and pro-life sides was destroyed by the Roe v. Wade decision since the issue was legally settled. And while there is some merit to that perspective, it ignores a very specific story about the financial picture of the situation. In 1978, the National Right to Life Coalition had debts as large as $25,000 according to an internal report and was considered to be in very dire financial straits. This group would end up being bailed out of their debts, but the people who did so had some very different ideas about how their advocacy should be carried out. We'll hold all this for a second because before we continue this story, we need a proper introduction to what would become two of the most powerful forces in conservative politics. After the defeat of Ronald Reagan in the 1964 primary, many factions within the conservative wing of the Republican Party were disillusioned with the lack of conservative political infrastructure, which they felt handicapped their movement. During this time, it was a popular opinion to call the conservatives the, quote, stupid party. They had a reputation for being a collection of religious zealots who were standing in the way of social progress. So to change this perception, members of the conservative movement would attempt to create organizations, think tanks, etc. to give their hateful ideologies a pretty suit. If you allow me to editorialize for a bit, social conservatism is a fundamentally irrational mode of thought. It's impossible to argue against social progress of the 60s and social progress today in intellectual good faith. Most people who stand in the way of social progress must detach their intellectual position from the psychological bigotry that it actually comes from. When Ben Shapiro talks about his position on same-sex marriage, he goes on some abstract speech about states' interests or promoting families through the tax code or whatever, but his actual position on the issue is not any more sophisticated than simple disgust. He finds gay people disgusting. And of course, in the political environment that he finds himself in, he can't just simply go out there and say that. That's his actual position, and there's no way of rationally defending it because the reason he holds this position come from very irrational places of the brain. That aside, in order for the conservative movement to emerge from the margins, Son Willents, professor of American history at Princeton University, notes that the social conservatives in particular had very little influence over the general public and the political establishment. The founding of the Heritage Foundation in 1973 and the rise of Jerry Falwell's moral majority in 1979 were the start of this attempt to get smart. The Heritage Foundation was an alliance between a social conservative, two big business Republicans, a legacy think tank tank official, and various media figures that was designed to create a conservative counterpoint to the massively influential center-left Brookings Institute. So let's look at the characters who make up this alliance. Providing former think tank experience was Edwin Fuller, who was an analyst at the Center for Strategic and International Studies and was also an executive director of the Republican Study Committee. Mikey Edwards, who was a former magazine editor, would lend his expertise in media, public relations, advertising, etc. Paul Reich would play the role of the social conservative and was actually the one who convinced Joseph Coors to bankroll the operation. And so that brings us to the people who would cut the checks for the operation. Joseph Coors, president of Coors Brewing Company and grandson of its founder, Adolf Coors, as well as Richard Mellon Scavey, grandson of Richard B. Mellon. These would be the people who would fork over money for the foundation's initial funding. Okay, so let's back up a second and think about what we just witnessed. So we have two respectable, quote-unquote, big business billionaires making bedfellows with three very hardcore conservatives. Now, if you look back at the 1964 Republican primary showdown that we just went over, you had a similar cast of characters, but back then they were pretty much at each other's throat. So what changed between then and the founding of the Heritage Foundation in 1973? Well, big donors were essentially finally convinced that there was a mutually aligned interest that could be found between these two groups. People like Paul Weyrich could ensure electoral viability along with an agenda that supported big business interests, as long as people like Joseph Coors and Richard Mellon kept the money flowing into their organization. And along with groups like the Moral Majority, Paul Weyrich could make a pretty convincing argument that his politics could win elections for Republicans. Along with the Heritage Foundation, there was also people like Jerry Falwell Sr., who became institutions unto themselves. In 1956, Jerry Falwell got past the trauma of seeing his alcoholic father shoot his uncle to death, true story by the way, and started Thomas Road Baptist Church with a group of 53 like-minded Christians in Lynchburg, VA. Lynchburg. By all accounts, Thomas Road started out as a run-of-the-mill Baptist church. But what would make this church unique was Falwell's philosophy on fundraising. Thomas Road, and later the Moral Majority that he would be a co-founder of, would become innovators in the domain of church fundraising. Falwell was known for his somewhat popular televangelism program known as Old Time Gospel Hour, where he would ask for mail-in donations and advertise his Bibles and other Bible study products. Eventually, these fundraisers would turn political when he would ask his followers and long mailing lists to support his mission to morally transform American society. While a lot of the original footage of Old Time Gospel Hour has since been lost to the winds of time, based on what Jerry Falwell would later go on to say on social issues, we can assume that a lot of fear-mongering was involved. By the time Jerry Falwell co-founded the political lobbying organization, the Moral Majority, with Paul Weyrich, the mailing list that he created was invaluable to the advocacy arm of the conservative movement. So that was a really long aside, but let's take it back to the economically progressive, pro-life organizations like the ACCL that we were just talking about. So what happened to these organizations? Well, the Moral Majority basically just bought them out to gain a monopoly on the political messaging surrounding what they saw as a moral issue. Again, these early pro-life groups didn't necessarily see abortion as a moral issue. They definitely did. There were some tinges to that. But they sort of saw every abortion as a tragedy, and they wanted to help women sort of avoid this through, things like pregnancy discrimination and, contraception and things like that. Very far away from sort of the hardcore fundamentalist Christian perspective that we know pro-life advocacy for today. And if you look at the money situation, it's very clear to see why early pro-life groups sort of took this deal with the Moral Majority. By the late 1970s, the Moral Majority was raising as much money as $1 billion a week from Falwell's audience of 2.5 million evangelicals and paid off debts of the ACCL, sort of in exchange for a shift in their ideological outlook. What I want you to understand about Christian evangelicals in the United States is that they are not really a monolithic group of people, and different factions within the umbrella have different ideas about how the Bible calls them to act vis-a-vis politics. Traditionally, evangelicals have not been a great group of people to try to organize because they usually refrain from carrying their religious convictions into the political sphere, favoring a more inwardly reflective form of religious expression. Most evangelicals believe that the only way through the Father is through the Son, a very common Christian expression, and thus they reject the use of any positive political power as ineffective compared to the power of interpersonal and small community religious experiences. Like, is there any law against gay marriage that is going to be more powerful than this?
Turn around and tell those people. Tell them. I'm not gay no more. I am delivered.
Slay. Most of the time, the political leanings of Christians were mostly decided on the fault lines of class, not religion, resulting in them leaning mostly towards Democrats, if anything. Working class people are more likely to be religious, and in the 1930s and 1940s, worker-focused politicians like FDR would exploit this to great success, pulling evangelical voters into their coalition. But second revivalist evangelicals would ultimately reject their traditional absence from the political sphere and would often loudly advocate for specific policy positions. As we just went over, Jerry Falwell was one of the people who took this perspective. While other popular evangelicals would make similar arguments for political engagement, Falwell, by virtue of his fundraising prowess, was one of the first of his kind to be able to exercise this kind of political power. And for Falwell, the money that he was given from his followers was given to him by God, making it a mortal sin to sort of not use it towards political events. There was a sort of call by divine revelation for him to exercise the power that he had amassed. Some Christians have a sort of victim complex, and I don't even necessarily mean that as an insult. I mean that persecution is one of the main features of the Christian lore. For those of you who aren't that far into the manga, spoiler alert for a book that came out 2,000 years ago, 85% of the Christian New Testament is basically a story of people leaving their homes to preach the word of God, and then they were eaten by lions or some crazy thing like that. As Christians began to find themselves as one of the most politically powerful groups in America, it became very difficult for them not to use that political power to shape the world in their image. Reverend James L. Sullivan would have this to say when addressing the Southern Baptist Convention. "There was a time when our nation sensed the need for what Baptists can deliver more than now. A world that had thought we were an ignorant, barefoot, once geloosed, was jarred out of its seat when it found out that our voluntary gifts in a year are approximately 1.5 billion, and that on average Sunday our church baptizes about 3 times as many people as were baptized at Pentecost. If we do not seize this opportunity, I think God's condemnation will be upon us." At a philosophical level, Protestants who took this view are of the belief that the United States is a fundamentally white Christian nation, whose land is bestowed upon to them by divine right. It's basically manifest destiny, but for 1970s. There's also a sort of death culty vibe to some parts of this thinking. Some Christians see their political project as the fulfillment of the prophecy of Revelations, wherein they can manifest the end times by constructing God's kingdom right here on earth, and they're going to do that through the United States. It is hard to know exactly how many Christians feel this way towards political engagement, but my guess is that at least between the 40s through the 70s, this was actually quite a rather fringe position to take. President Carter, who is one of the most explicitly evangelical voices in American politics, certainly took this view. And while it might seem like a contradiction, being president is like literally exactly the opposite of being detached from politics, but again, evangelicals were never opposed to working within politics. They just sort of viewed politics and religion as separate spheres. In an interview, Carter was asked about how his faith would impact his presidential administration, and he had this to say.
"So we wouldn't see a cabinet composed exclusively of Baptists?"
No, as a matter of fact, I don't know how many Baptists we have on my immediate staff.
And so the point I'm trying to make is that Carter wasn't necessarily trying to sign into action biblical law. But he did allow his personal Christian ethics to inform his political views on governance and, his broader political worldview. This is to say that there is a difference between making a Christian country and governing with Christian values. Sort of make this make more sense, I'm going to use the example of, Amy Coney Barrett and Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. These people are both Catholics, and, while Justice Barrett is using her political power to try to legally enforce a Christian morality, AOC is using her faith to inform the progressive values that she champions as her position as a U.S. representative. Okay, so but before researching this video, I sort of believed the backlash narrative, which paints white evangelicals as people who were ready to pounce at any moral grievance that they saw in public life, But sort of the more I read about the political situation in the 1970s, the more I realized that it takes an intense level of effort, money, fear-mongering to turn people towards a political agenda that centers hatred as its main feature. I think that most religious people are rather ambivalent with the way that other people choose to live their life. Again, the hate the sin, not the sinner is kind of the attitude. And, while this attitude is still problematic, there's a massive leap between, this belief and a politics that uses the state to enforce a certain way of life. And that transition takes a lot of time, money, and energy. I've spent a lot of time with American Christians, and they have various views on politics. But I think for them, the only responsibility that they feel in a public sphere is to sort of be there with open arms and to bear witness to Christ or whatever they get up to. And it's sort of interesting. I think they really do need to get convinced that there's some sort of existential threat to their way of life in order for them to be politically useful to conservative Republicans. And so to wrap this section up, it's basically a bunch of rich conservatives got a bunch of people together. They ended up convincing a bunch of evangelicals that their moral way of life was under attack, and, they got riled up. That's basically how the conservative propaganda machine started. It sort of started in the 1970s with groups like the Heritage Foundation. That's what we got going on.
Which cereal has more vitamin nutrition than any other? Kellogg's Product 19 cereal. But you'd never guess.
Oh.
Because Product 19 vitamins are flaky, bumpy, crispy, crunchy, and taste so good. Product 19 goodness comes from corn, oats, wheat, and rice.
Delicious.
Kellogg's Product 19.
Flaky,
Bumpy,
crispy, crunchy.
Tasty vitamins.
Remember when we used to be a real country, I could get my product without any of the gosh darn wokeness? Welcome to Eagle River Radio, the conservative talk show with the most brick walls in the background. Today we're talking about our Lord and Savior who died for our sins. Yes, I'm talking about Ronald Reagan. When I get into heaven, I'm going to give Ronald Reagan a firm handshake for each brick on this wall. Well, anyway, sorry about that. In today's show, we got a lot to cover. First, we're going to talk about how the Carter presidency ended in disaster. Then we're going to talk about how Ronald Reagan and George Bush Sr. revived the upper class. And finally, we're going to talk about the vice president's rich kid son who became a failed artist. He also was elected president. That's an interesting resume. So Jimmy Carter, wrong place, wrong time. As mentioned earlier, Jimmy was a old school evangelical, and in fact, the first evangelical ever elected to the office of the presidency. Based on his religious beliefs, Carter was our last president who really took a principled stand against war and worked towards maintaining a positive Pax Americana, American peace. I think his humanitarian work in his post-presidency speaks a lot to his character, moral principles, and political pragmatism. And that's not to whitewash any of the bad things that happened in his presidency, but, we're grading on a curve here. But unfortunately, for the only president to have a sandwich chain named after him, Jimmy Carter was the unluckiest president in history. Upon taking office, Jimmy was tasked with handling an energy crisis that caused the Yom Kippur War of 1973. His rhetoric could have been a bit more confident instead of the sort of American winter speech that he did end up giving, but in terms of policy, I don't really think there was a lot he could have done different. And then there was also the Iranian hostage crisis of 1979, wherein 52 American diplomats and citizens were taken hostage by militarized college students in Tehran. These events triggered another energy crisis and another round of inflation. Both of these failures of U.S. foreign policy are laid at the feet of Jimmy Carter, but the real root cause of all these events go back years and years previous and are failures beyond the blame of any single president. But the political consequences of these events did have to be paid by someone, and, well, that person was Jimmy Carter. But why was that person Jimmy Carter? Well, there happens to be a relatively substantial amount of evidence that Ronald Reagan, Mr. Americana himself, negotiated a backroom deal to ensure that the hostages in Iran wouldn't be released until Reagan took office. So let's start with the circumstantial evidence. Yes, we're going down this rabbit hole. People found it rather suspicious that the hostages were freed just hours before the inauguration of President-elect Reagan. Sean Willens does a good job recounting the story from Jimmy Carter's perspective, so I'll read it from his book. The symbolic transition occurred not at Ronald Reagan's inauguration on January 20th, 1981, but in the hours that preceded it. After 10 weeks of additional strenuous negotiation with the Iranians, Jimmy Carter, now sleepless for 2 nights and worn to the marrow, received word just after 6:30 a.m. that a final agreement had been arranged for the release of the hostages in Tehran. At 7 o'clock, he placed a call to the official guest residence, Blair House, to tell his successor the joyous news. But the call was taken by an aide of Reagan's who said that the governor had had a long night, was sleeping, and could not be disturbed. "You're kidding," Jimmy Carter said. "No, sir, I am not." Carter, other than being surprised that Reagan wasn't up at 6:30 a.m., he was a peanut farmer after all, was shocked to hear that Reagan wasn't as concerned about the situation as he was. There was also the nature of the negotiations themselves. Throughout the negotiation process that went around 444 days, by the way, Iran was driving a rather hard bargain, trying to avoid long-term sanctions with both the US and the United Nations. To add a bit more context, the Iranian government at the time was pretty upset about the actions of the militarized college students, and many officials saw it as a sort of international embarrassment. But just before Reagan's inauguration, the Iranian officials suddenly became willing to make concessions that they previously weren't. Former member of the National Security Council under Carter, Gary Sick, had this to say.
Basically, they lost almost, in the order of $8 billion in that trade. And at the very last second, they changed their terms totally, and basically were willing to make concessions that we would never have even asked for in doing the negotiations.
There was also the behavior of Reagan's campaign manager at the time, who would later become the director of the CIA, William Casey. It's more likely than not that William Casey went to Madrid to visit with 4 Iranian officials to discuss this scheme. Joseph Werner Reed, who went on to work in the Reagan administration as a diplomat in Morocco, also wrote a letter to his family saying that he was proud of the role he played in preventing the release of the American hostages. There's also the details of the Iran-Contra scandal that happened to line up perfectly with the situation. For those of you who need a reminder of this scandal, the Reagan administration was routing guns to the Iranian government despite an arms embargo in order to send money to the Contras. These Contras were a far-right rebel group who were fighting the leftist Sandinistas in Nicaragua. According to the public records of the case, the first round of arms that were sold to the Iranians took place in 1981, just months after Reagan's inauguration. So all of that doesn't necessarily imply that Reagan knew about it, but I'm just here reporting the facts, folks. It seems like there was a lot of people in his orbit who were doing some crazy things. I know this seems like a crazy conspiracy theory, and it kind of is, but I've cited the PBS, the New York Times, as well as a former member of the National Security Council. You can reference all my sources in the description, not only for this part, but for the whole video. Also, hit the like button while you're down there. By the time the 1980 elections rolled around, a ham sandwich could have beaten Jimmy John's. I probably could have beat him. But Reagan was no ham sandwich. He was a full-blown, mildly successful actor. Kind of like this guy. In all seriousness, Reagan was a trained actor who started his career as a C-list actor, but found himself as a go-to for advertisers who were looking for a spokesperson with a calming voice. Reagan Balenciaga, eye-catching, isn't it? That's my little note. Partially because Jimmy Carter was in such a weak position, and partially because Reagan could get in his bag in front of a camera, Reagan was able to pitch sort of a vague message of economic prosperity and foreign policy, instead of the sort of inflammatory evangelical moral concerns that his base was primarily fired up about. And I don't mean to use vague as an insult here, it's actually a pretty good political strategy. If you're as far up on your political opponent as Reagan was, giving policy specifics only serves to alienate voters and distract from the unpopularity of your opponent in the media narrative. So basically, to the American public, Reagan was for good things and against bad things, and had basically 2 big promises outside of that. First, he was going to create jobs by revitalizing the American workforce. The second main promise of his campaign was that he was going to project peace across the world by showing the military strength of the United States, a sort of negative Pax Americana compared to the idealism that sort of defined the Carter Doctrine, as they call it. So if you were an average voter in the 1970s, this pitch was basically enough to at least give Reagan a chance to win your vote. But to the extent that Reagan did preach a tangible political ideology, what he was saying did have some grassroots excitement. And I'm not just talking about the sort of culture war issues either, it was economics too. As mainstream as these ideas seem now, there was sort of something naughty or edgy about believing in free market fundamentalism. The Chicago School of Economic Thought, championed by people like Milton Friedman, were sort of seen as the bad boys in the economics field because they rejected big government and Keynesian theory that was sort of the status quo at the time. Ayn Rand was also becoming a mini celebrity alongside with Freeman for her capitalist Wattpad fiction. For now, let's take a step back and look at the shifts in thinking that have brought us to this point. The Republican Party to this point has successfully rebranded itself, completing a political realignment that would put it in a dominant position for a long time to come. The Heritage Foundation bet had paid off, creating a unified front out of reactionary Christians, neoconservative hawks, and neoliberal economic libertarians. The main thread that sort of connected all these groups together was communism. The Webster Dictionary defines communism as anything to the left of Bill Clinton. Wait, this is the PragerU Study Bible. The reason why we gotta put communism in air quotes in this situation is because there was very little distinction made between the totalitarian states of the USSR and the progressives in the United States, as well as leftists in places like South America, for example. And all of these different interests that made up the so-called Reagan coalition had a different reason to paint over these nuances. Let's call it the conservative Venn diagram. For reactionary Christians, socialists abroad and progressives at home represented the godless hordes that were attempting to make their country a more secular place, something that they were very uncomfortable with. For foreign policy neoconservatives, the leftist opposition at home was preventing them from using the full force of the US military to its strategic advantage. And for economic libertarians, the socialist critique undermined the base assumptions that individual virtue and economics and financial success were one and the same. For neoconservatives and evangelicals, wars abroad fighting communism were conceptualized as a sort of nouveau crusade, fighting foreign threats to Christendom. This idea was used to justify staying in Vietnam and Korea. Pope John Paul probably felt this way about the Sandinistas, and of course, this was also a big part of the rationalization that George Bush used when he ended up invading Iraq. Reactionary evangelicals and economic libertarians share an emphasis on individual virtue as opposed to systemic analysis. Many evangelicals hold the belief, either implicitly or explicitly, that God blesses his strongest soldiers, and thus economic despair is evidence that a person has not kept to the moral code that is found fully within the Bible. It is a sort of evolution of the Protestant work ethic that views labor as sharing in a part of the suffering that Jesus Christ experienced on the cross. Economic libertarians hold the same view but take a secular approach to its justification, believing that disparities between wealth are created as a direct result of differences in value that are created by different individuals, ignoring, again, any systemic factors that lead to inequality. It's the classic myth of meritocracy. And of course, neoliberals and neocons made good friends because, well, war profits are a thing. Also, neocolonialism is predicated on a powerful military in order to keep trade routes open and enforce good trading terms on the international stage. Now that all of these interests were unified behind a single frontman, there wasn't much in the way of political opposition that could get in their way. It's hard to understate just how dominant the Reagan coalition was within American politics. I mean, just look at these electoral maps. These maps are bleeding red harder than my Kumon assignments. That's a joke for a person who had a very specific childhood. The Overton window shifted so hard to the right during this era that all politicians had to reckon with the fact that neoliberal economic ideas were part of an unquestionable consensus. Bill Clinton, who was the first Democrat to break through in '92, broke away from the tradition of Democrats like LBJ and FDR and gave into the new normal, only differentiating himself on social issues and perceived competency. A similar set of dynamics took place in the United Kingdom during the 80s with Margaret Thatcher's tenure as Prime Minister. And a quote that's been attributed to her is that she considered the rebranding of Labour to New Labour and the rise of Tony Blair as her greatest achievement. And while it's a debate on whether or not she actually said that, she would have been correct if she did. Because of the immense popularity of figures like Thatcher, a lot of the conservative economic ideas just became sort of common sense within politics. Blair had this to say when asked about his personal relationship with Thatcher. Thatcher was immensely kind and generous to me when I was Prime Minister. Politically, certain reforms she made, for example, in trade union law, we kept the basic legal framework. We didn't renationalize any of the state industries that she had privatized. I thought my job was to build on some of the things that she had done rather than reverse them. Whenever I wanted to ask her for advice, she would always give it in a genuine, spirited way. When the leader of the Labour Party basically gives up on trade union reform, you know something's gone wrong. Bill Clinton's presidency fell victim, in my editorial opinion, to the same pitfall, ceding a lot of ground to Republicans on the economics, most notably in trade unions, and welfare reform. This legacy continues to this day and has only begun to change in recent years. Through the 2010s, Democrats had often been embarrassed to label themselves as liberals or progressives, especially on economic issues, and sort of took for granted the voting's public fear over things like government deficits, for example. Recently, though, neoliberal consensus has begun to be challenged from both parties. Trump's trade policy, for example, revived protectionism, making it politically viable in the political realm for the first time in basically forever. Joe Biden has also pushed for trade union protections recently and tried to pass the infrastructure bill that probably would have been one of the most expansive pieces of public investment since Eisenhower. But if you do the math on that, it's been about 36 years of neoliberal economics, and we're definitely still living in that era. While the shift in the political environment was a good deal for Republicans, it's not all sunshine and rainbows for the coalition, though. This video is called The Great Compromise after all. Just because all the populist energy and big money backing came into focus in the perfect time in the 80s, it doesn't mean that the fault lines of the past magically faded away. Perhaps the most uncomfortable differences between the establishment Republicans and the grassroots social conservatives is still that of culture. The cultural differences are huge. There is an ocean of difference between your average megachurch goer and somebody like our good old friend Richard Scafey, who was an active socialite in Pittsburgh and a divorcee. While it may seem like these sort of cultural differences are trivial and sort of a trivial thing to keep bringing up, if you understand politics, you'll understand that people don't really make decisions based on diligent research into political candidates, but rather make decisions sort of based off of vibes. And for a lot of the politicians, they did not pass the grassroots vibe check, at least not naturally. Take Senator Ted Cruz, for example. The man is a Harvard, Princeton graduate who went to private schools his whole life and is more comfortable at cocktail parties with Alan Dershowitz than he is mixing with his own supporters. Yet he still goes on TV and does stuff like this.
They're trying to go after and regulate ceiling fans. I got to tell you, it's hot in Texas. We don't want to get rid of our ceiling fans. And now these idiots have come out and said, drink 2 beers a week. That's their guideline. Well, I got to tell you, if they want us to drink 2 beers a week, frankly, they can kiss my ass.
No, okay.
Very early on in the rise of the conservative movement, politicians of this ilk realized that they were going to have to dramatically overhaul their public image if they were going to stand a chance in the new landscape of the Republican Party. One of the first politicians to learn this the hard way was none other than 43 himself, George Bush.
Now watch this drive.
If you look at his dad, George H.W. was considered to be a moderate VP pick and a counterpoint to the hardline conservative that Ronald Reagan represented. And this tracks with the East Coast aristocracy that the Bush family came from. I mean, just take a look at this picture. Bush 43, like Cruz, was twice Ivy League educated and spent his entire life in proximity to wealth and political power. And when he started his political career with a run for Texas's 19th congressional district in 1978, he lost on a 6-point margin to Kent Haines, who highlighted the fact that he was an out-of-touch elitist. Well, and Mr. Haines was right. He certainly was an out-of-touch elitist. His dad had just got done being the literal director of the CIA, taking over just months after the events of Watergate. After losing that election, he promised himself that he would never be out good old boyed again, and decided to radically change his public image for his next political venture, running for governor of Texas in 1994. This election would be a perfect test for how well he could pull off the whole populist tap dance. But it wasn't going to be easy. Not only would he have to convince people that he wasn't simply riding off the coattails of his popular father, he was going up against an incredibly popular incumbent who never needed to fake how Texas she really was. The 45th governor of Texas, Miss Ann Richards. The term proto-Trump gets thrown around by political commentators who are, quite frankly, less good-looking than I am, to describe politicians who relied heavily on their bravado to connect with voters, and I think Ann Richards definitely counts as one. Governor Richards had a larger-than-life Texas-style personality and had a knack for making very witty one-liners to make fun of Republicans. She was an intense critic of George H.W. and was given the name of That Woman by Barbara Bush, a nickname that she would go on to embrace. In the 1988 Democratic National Convention, she had this to say about Reagan and Bush.
He can't help it. He was born with a silver foot in his mouth.
She was a hardcore Democrat and a hardcore feminist, but no person in their right mind would try to dispute her Texas credentials. And even in an intensely conservative Texas, she was able to win her election by securing a 2% margin with 49% of the vote. So in the 1996 election, Richards found herself in an intensely competitive race with our good old friend George Bush. Unfortunately, she wasn't quite able to pull it off, but she did have a good run, all things considered. Ann Richards was quite ahead of her time looking back at it. In an ultra-conservative political environment, she was able to win a state like Texas by having a very clear philosophy about politics and accurately diagnosing the problem that Democrats had back then. There was a certain timidity in the post-Reagan years among Democrats who were afraid of attacking conservative figures, and this is part of the reason why the political zeitgeist was stuck on the conservative dial for so long. Ann Richards was able to diagnose this problem several years and maybe decades before it became obvious to other political observers.
The Democratic Party did not seem to have a voice. It didn't seem to be able to enunciate who it was. You had a bunch of candidates who were running around with a mushy message, and the American people don't care for mush.
So what have we learned today? We learned that the Reagan coalition is a very strong political force when it is firing on all cylinders. And second, we learned that right-wing populists are a very fickle mistress and are very much influenced by the aesthetic qualities of the politicians that they are presented with. In the next half of this video, we'll take a look at how the conservative coalition that had been built up through the 70s and 80s began to show cracks as America began to change. This is Red River Radio, P40, signing out. Gather round, folks, gather round. Let's spill the tea about John Boehner. The election of President Obama was an inflection point within American politics, and at the time it felt like a reprieve from the conservative politics that had been dominant since the 1980s. But very early into his presidency, that illusion was immediately shattered. From the moment Obama made his inaugural address, there was immediate backlash to the fact that the country had just elected its first black president. This would lead to a rise of the so-called Tea Party, a right-wing grassroots movement that would become an acronym for Tax Enough Already. On paper, the Tea Party was a group of libertarian-minded Republicans who were upset about the tax and spend policies of the Democrats and wanted to push Republicans into a more aggressive posture against them. The reason why I say libertarian in heavy air quotes is because it feels intrinsically wrong for me to address them as such. For every principled libertarian like Ron Paul, there were maybe 27 ultra-orthodox conservatives like Michelle Bachmann and such who were comfortable blowing up the budget as long as it went towards military spending. And while the Tea Party existed under the cover of libertarianism, the movement was almost entirely astroturfed by Americans for Prosperity, a group funded by Charles and David Koch, who have since taken up the mantle of funding these conservative causes. For me, calling the Tea Party libertarian feels like it separates the movement from the broader cycle of astroturf conservative backlash that we have discussed in this video, buying into its framing that it's mostly concerned with fiscal responsibility. Really, what the movement represents was a sort of hijacking of actually populist movements to the end of moneyed interests. But whatever the Tea Party was, they certainly made their presence known by the time the 2010 midterms rolled around. Obama and the Democrats were going to face an uphill battle in these midterm elections. The economy was sputtering from the 2008 financial crisis, and the political response on the part of the Obama administration was controversial to say the least. The federal government would bail out both the banking sector as well as GM and Chrysler, which in hindsight, was kind of needed, but they also went really light on the punishment. Most of these people walked away with just a slap on the wrist, despite the fact that they would go on to give their CEOs huge, bonus packages. Privatized gains and socialized losses is how the American taxpayer felt, having had to take a loss from the economic recession itself, and then again having to bail out these big corporations on the back end. And so it was a very unstable political environment, and this is when the Tea Party was able to transcend into power. So when you combine the racially motivated Christian backlash with the larger economic backlash surrounding the events of the financial crisis, what you end up with is a massive red wave. The tragedy of this situation, and really the central tragedy of this whole video, is that conservative propaganda machine is always ready to distract people from asking difficult questions about our economics and class structure in favor of a culture war that feels more ethereal. Nonetheless, the right-wing excitement led to Republicans picking up 6 seats in the Senate and 63 seats in the House of Representatives, giving them control of the latter. A substantial amount of Republicans who won these midterm elections were freshman members who were elected off of the excitement that the Tea Party brought, and going into Washington, they brought with them their inflammatory politics. Democrats didn't really help with the polarization either. The Democrats who did survive the so-called red wave were typically a bit farther to the left than mainstream Democrats, who were taking the brunt of the blame for the policy reaction to the financial crisis. Anyway, because of the aforementioned reasons, the 112th Congress was poised to be one of the most polarized in modern US history, and it certainly did not disappoint. This hyperpartisanship gave rise to the idea that there could be some sort of grand bargain where, the level-headed voices on each side of the political spectrum could come together to form a grand vision for the country's future. You know, this sort of idea where partisan squabbles could be the thing of the past and, you know, both parties can agree on screwing over poor and old people. I'm crying just thinking about it. But what were the specific things that the Democrats and Republicans would actually compromise on? Well, a good place to start would be the debt limit battles that have taken place for years in order to make sure that the federal government has enough money to stay open. We call these negotiations the debt ceiling negotiations. So the absurdity of the debt ceiling is difficult to convey to people who aren't necessarily familiar with politics because it's just hard to describe how ridiculous the whole situation is. I mean, most people have a bad opinion of government as it is, but few people assume this cartoonish level of stupidity. So if you're not familiar, get ready because this is a weird one. Basically, the government needs money to run, and because we only collect taxes once a year, we usually just put all that spending on the credit card, or in this case, what we call the national debt. And because Congress has constitutional authority over the national purse, or spending power, they need to give the executive branch the ability to run up said credit card. So before World War I, Congress basically bundled the debt limit with the federal budget. Congress would pass a budget, look at the amount of revenue that they needed to throw at said budget, and then would give the US Treasury the authority to take on the debt required to fulfill the difference. The problem with this solution, however, is that we decided to get involved in World War I, and the US Treasury needed to borrow money faster than Congress was willing to grant them the authority to do so. So in 1917, Congress passed the Second Liberty Bond Act, as opposed to the First Liberty Bond Act, to grant the Treasury the ability to sell war bonds to help fund the military escapades of the U.S. Marine Corps. What this act did moving forward, however, was to set up a statutory limit, Genshin Impact players seething, that could be raised periodically in order to grant the Treasury the authority to borrow. So basically, instead of signing off on the borrowing needed to execute each budget, Congress basically just gave the Treasury a credit card limit and said, you know, do whatever you need to do to execute on the laws that we've already passed. And this was a perfect system with absolutely no room for exploits, he said in an overly confident and sinister tone to foreshadow the fact that there were indeed exploits. Starting in the 1990s, Republicans decided to use the statutory debt limit as well as the budget negotiation as leverage when they didn't have control over the White House. When this strategy was first tried by Newt Gingrich, who took the government to a shutdown after failing to pass a budget, Republicans learned the hard way that they would be the ones who took the brunt of the blame for this debacle. And this whole negotiation thing over the debt ceiling is something that Congress could easily make go away by simply passing a bill that states that the federal government can borrow all the money it needs to execute the budget of the laws that have already been passed by the Congress. The dirty little secret in Washington, however, is that even though every politician laments the fact that the debt limit is used as a political football, most of them actually want it to stay around pretty much forever. The reason why the debt limit stays around is because it helps members of Congress get elected. This is because it helps lesser known politicians get some media momentum and boost their national name recognition. It basically just allows random members of Congress to get on a soapbox whenever they want to. Furthermore, the threat of a government shutdown gives leverage to certain politicians who want to bundle different legislation with the debt limit. So in 2011, as the debt ceiling countdown began to loom, Obama and the Speaker of the House at the time, John Boehner, anyway, both Obama and Boehner came to the conclusion that creating a grand bargain between the GOP and Dems to end the debt ceiling shutdown once and for all was a perfect way to get them both a legacy-defining political achievement. They were thinking about their legacy. It would have been one of the most devious licks of all time. But to make the compromise work, the two made it publicly known that they would be willing to sacrifice key policy priorities that their parties held. For the Dems, that was cuts to Social Security and Medicare. And for Republicans, it was increasing taxes. Those were the two things that they both put on the table. The mainstream view was that this set of policy targets, the cutting of entitlements, the raising of tax revenues, and the elimination of the statutory debt limit, again, all of this would have been bundled, would have been a wonderful federal deficit reduction measure that would have been healthy for the economy in the long run. Again, this would have been a big political achievement if it could have been pulled off. But in my humble opinion, this couldn't be any farther from the truth. The national debt is not a bad thing, and all things considered, the US doesn't really have a debt problem. In 2010, during the time these negotiations were going around, the United States had a debt to GDP ratio of around 85%, which is relatively low. To put that number in a little bit of context, Japan has had a debt to GDP ratio north of 200% since the 1990s, and they've been doing just fine despite monetary theorists in the United States predicting their ever-present doom. And while every economy certainly is different, as long as you're using that borrowed money to make investments into the economy to make it more efficient, you are going to be able to take enough money out on the back end through taxes to make the accrual of debt worth it in the long run. And then also on a policy level, it basically would have just been a giveaway to rich people and big corporations. Cuts to Social Security would have been devastating for the elderly, and the tax revenue increases would have been paid for by middle-income taxpayers, leaving businesses and high-income earners relatively untouched. So what I'm trying to get at is that the grand bargain was essentially a massive concession to big business Republicans on major policy issues that have defined the past 70 years of American politics. Simply put, it was a massive dub for Republicans. So Republicans were really happy, and for a second, it really seemed like the grand bargain could be a real possibility. Both Nancy Pelosi and Senate Majority Leader Harry Reid ended up falling in line with Obama okaying the grand bargain with their caucus. But the problem for this whole deal was that John Boehner was having a lot of trouble dealing with the Tea Partiers who were not willing to eat an additional $800 billion in tax revenues. This grassroots libertarians that the Republicans used to get their massive majority in the House ended up coming at a very substantial cost to them. The people who aligned themselves with a movement called Tax Enough Already weren't simply going to remain silent as the biggest rhino of all time in John Boehner waltzed into Capitol Hill to shake hands with a black man to increase the amount of money that the federal government was going to take from them. On top of that, Social Security and Medicare are incredibly popular federal programs, especially among elderly Americans who made up a substantial part of the Tea Party movement, let's be honest. All of a sudden, the same grassroots group that the Koch spent all his time and money organizing in the 2010 midterms came out to their representatives' town halls demanding that the grand bargain be killed based on how it would impact them personally. The Tea Party Republicans who were elected by the grassroots were one of the first groups to flip on the grand bargain, and as pressure mounted back in their home districts, even more establishment-friendly Republicans began to switch their positions. When it became clear that the deal was no longer politically feasible, Obama and Boehner came together to pass the Budget Control Act of 2011, which was basically just a procedural bill to extend the debt limit, business as usual. They were sort of waving the flag on the whole grand bargain thing. But media, as well as centrists on the Hill, would continue to be hoping for some kind of grand bargain as late as 2015. But after John Boehner retired, that was basically all out the window. So at the end of the day, Boehner wasn't quite able to get the most outspoken members of his party to fall in line. Boehner, by all accounts, was a good man and a private yet dedicated Catholic. And for all my disagreements with the man, I have a deep appreciation for the Shakespearean tragedy that was his tenure as United States House Speaker. Being Speaker of the House has perhaps become one of the most terrible jobs in all of America, and it's certainly not one that I would want. Many people say that the career of John Boehner was a political failure. But at the end of the day, when the sun sets on the Capitol lawn and John Boehner goes back to see his wife and his kids, it was him who was given the opportunity to greet the Pope before his address to Congress, and it was John who served his country with pride and dignity. And now, how could anybody consider that a failure? Plus, now we get to get rich with the boys off of marijuana dispensaries. Let's go!
No, I paid the price. Always nice, no compromise. Flip the bricks, give mom a slice. Read the anger in my eyes. I still have no sympathy. A piece of it lifts me. Magic spell up like a pennant. Taking care of my dependents. Fly the flag up, independence. Pray for sin, pray for penance. Oh my country, 'tis the sweet land of misery. There is no amount of bars that can get me selling stars. In a bucket, young bucket. Eat the rich up, that's a Warren Buffett.
In hindsight, the Trump presidency was basically inevitable. If you were paying attention to the emergence of the Tea Party and the rest of the history that we just got done laying out, you begin to see that the Obama presidency fits perfectly into the cycle of progress and conservative backlash that were emblematic of the Reagan era. The reason why this backlash looked so new, however, was that the nature of the backlash had changed. With the advent of the internet, it became possible for there to be a decentralized backlash instead of one that was carefully orchestrated by institutional powers. Before Trump was actually elected in 2016, Obama felt like a new era in American politics. He was the first black president, his coalition was made up of racially ambiguous college kids, hey, how are you? And we all read into his campaign the possibility of real change. But looking back at his actual legislative achievements, it's pretty clear that Obama was not able to deliver the, quote, real change that was seemingly promised to us. So this presents us with a difficult conversation when discussing the legacy of President Trump. Where do we place him in context of American electoral history? Traditionally, we place the so-called Reagan era in between the 1980 election and the end of the Bush II administration, between the years 1980 and 2000. This analysis would make Obama the page-turn president. I, however, have a problem with this analysis. I would argue that the Trump presidency was an extension of the larger paradigm of the Reagan Revolution instead of a distinct blimp in American history that we all pretended it is. So let's take a look back at what the culture was cooking up in the Obama years and see if we can find any patterns. When Obama was elected, liberals took a victory lap. Racism ended, gay people were going to get married, and feminism once again had a moment. Social progressives took the opportunity that the Obama presidency presented to push more aggressively for their agenda. Not only were these groups free from the survival mode of the Bush years, but they were also fueled by a genuine excitement that the Obama victory provided for liberal causes. Fourth wave feminism, or as the cool kids like to call it, pop feminism, is likely the most recognizable fronts for 2010 social progressivism. Pop feminism was primarily concerned with so-called consciousness raising in order to mainstream classical feminist ideas like patriarchy, the male gaze, the wage gap, what have you. And more or less this strategy worked. I feel like we can safely say that a lot of these ideas are more known now than they were back then. Black Lives Matter also started in the Obama years with the killing of Trayvon Martin and the acquittal of George Zimmerman in 2013. While black Americans have always had grievances with the police, 2014 was the first time that these concerns were actually being seriously debated within the mainstream. And although not nearly enough progress has been made to actually address the problems that Black Lives Matter has brought to the fore, the movement did successfully shift discourse to the left. The public discussion went from outright denial of police brutality to simply we don't care. And so I guess you can call that progress if you want. BLM and feminism are probably the most recognizable movements to come out of the Obama years, but there were a lot of other cultural ideas floating around at the time. Trigger warnings and safe spaces first became prominent in public discourse around this time, and there were also some other ideas that, quite frankly, the American people were just not ready to deal with. Toxic masculinity, unconscious bias. These were relatively niche topics in academia before 2014, but they suddenly found themselves at the center of Fox News segments and videos about Anita Sarkeesian or whatever. These ideas are relatively benign when you actually understand what they are, but they were ripe for being misunderstood, and misunderstood they were. And so with all this cooking up in the background of the Obama years, a good old-fashioned backlash was in order. But as the manufactured outrage machine was ready to take off, it became clear that something fundamental had changed about it. When commentators who aren't as good looking as I am try to diagnose the reason why political discourse has broken down in the age of the internet, they often point to increased polarization and then point to both sides of the political spectrum with equal culpability. But when I reflect back on the internet discourse and the right-wing backlash of the 2010s, I see one side in the left that was admittedly a bit disorganized about the way it presented certain progressive concepts, and another side in the right that had fundamentally lost control of its most fringe elements. While it is true that Fox News saw explosive growth during the Obama years, that growth was mostly fueled by following their hardcore right-wing base that had become radicalized on the internet. What the internet did to right-wing media was the same thing that the internet did to everything else in the world. It democratized it. When you're a host on the Fox News network, there's an extremely thorough vetting process just to get in front of the camera. And furthermore, there's a very clear understanding of the editorial stance that these hosts are allowed to take. And that was pretty much the only game in town for a very long time. Even old school televangelists and talk show radio hosts had some funding in order to get their operation off the ground, and the really popular and influential ones basically ran in accordance with the best wishes of the Republican Party and the broader conservative movement as a whole. And because of this, interest groups like the Republican Party, the Heritage Foundation, and the Moral Majority were able to sort of cap out the amount of crazy that would make it onto television screens and radio airwaves. But in the age of Facebook groups and start up YouTube channels, these interest groups suddenly lost a lot of their institutional power. In his book, The Rise of the Alt-Right, author Thomas J. Maine makes the argument that the proliferation of the internet made possible the material conditions for people like Steve Bannon and Alex Jones to make a name for themselves. Even though Maine is talking about the official alt-right here, categorized by people who were concerned with recruiting young men like Richard Spencer and Milo Yiannopoulos, I don't think he gives enough credit to the internet for just how subversive it was to Republican politics even before the rise of the alt-right. Even as far back as the 2008 campaign, John McCain, who was viewed as a sensible Republican, a moderate Republican, had to basically shut down a chronically brain-broken old woman who was spewing conspiracy theories about Obama.
I got to ask you a question. I do not I can't trust Obama. I have read about him, and he's an Arab. He is not. No?
No, ma'am. He's a decent family man, citizen that I just happen to have disagreements with on fundamental issues, and that's what this campaign is all about. He's not. Thank you. Thank you.
What many Republicans failed to grapple with at this time was that the evangelical white conservatives that the big business Republicans had made an alliance with were starting to become a major liability to them. When you are grooming a group of people to despise another political party, there is only so far you can allow them to go. There needs to be a balance between making your voters excited to get out to the polls without making them so radical that they become impossible to work with within the political sphere. And so what this McCain moment represents is the first time that the mainstream Republicans were losing the dangerous hand that they were playing. If you convince a whole group of people that the opponent is literally the spawn of Hitler or Satan, you can't necessarily get surprised when they don't act fully rationally. After all, the only response to pure evil is complete annihilation. And as we talked about, this is basically what ruined the grand bargain. A bunch of people like this old woman in the clip voted for a bunch of hardcore populists who were completely unwilling to actually do any governing, and it destroyed a deal that was massively favorable to moderate Republicans. It's difficult to find a starting point, but I think the anti-black resentment that was unleashed against Obama is a pretty good place to start. Via Facebook, several conspiracies were birthed. Get it? Birth? Ha ha ha. I can't believe I'm about to say this out loud, but Obama is gay. Obama is a crack fiend. Obama is a gay crack fiend. Obama is a Muslim. Obama is a Kenyan. Michelle Obama is a man. And this is just the greatest hits album. The B-sides were crazy. These conspiracies spawned out of Boomer Facebook and were really targeted at legacy members of the conservative movement. The same people who were involved with American politics during the 1970s were making their mark once again in the form of Fox News viewership. So that's what the boomers were up to, but the real interesting story is what was happening to the kids. Were the kids all right? No, they really weren't. YouTube at this time was filled with the most tasteless anti-feminist screeds you could possibly imagine.
2016. Just about every game that has any sort of customization has a male or female as its first choice.
Alright, what they said here was really, really dumb.
Okay, let's hear what the sexist furry has to say. Rags, we still have beef. I'm coming for you. These group of content creators, who we can call gamergators, were making a living riling up their audience of white young gamers who, of course, are the most oppressed minority, into hating whatever feminist villain du jour happened to pop up at the time. Remember, female playable characters were starting to be put in games like Call of Duty and such, and games like Sad Lesbian Simulator and Depression Quest were being released. Okay, I think it's finally time to talk about this. Gamergate was a harassment campaign that was organized on the website 4chan for the sole purpose of attacking and silencing women who they decided were infringing on the Gaming Boys Club. You ever feel like I'm just screaming into a room right now about the most online shit ever? It's actually very difficult. The main characters of this campaign were Zoe Quinn, the developer of the aforementioned Depression Quest, Anita Sarkeesian, who was the feminist villain of the day for about 6 years straight, and later a journalist named Lehigh Alexandra, who wrote an article about Gamergate. A lot of people say that Gamergate was standing up to unfair practices in the games media industry, but that is simply untrue. That's like saying Charlottesville was about the removal of the Robert E. Lee statue, or saying that the Tulsa Race Massacre was about financial regulations. You're completely missing the point, buddy. So I'm not going to recap this entire saga because we'd be here until the second coming of Jesus Christ. But all you really need to know right now is that this sort of organization to create a harassment campaign was basically the creation of the alt-right pipeline. Conservative person and Breitbart tech editor at the time, Milo Yiannopoulos, it's hard to figure out what to call him, would basically launch his career off of the events of this whole saga, and the Breitbart website itself would go on to explode in readership. The infrastructure that was created around this harassment campaign would also prove to be fertile grounds for recruitment into even more insidious parts of the alt-right. It's sort of a common take or a common meme on the internet to call Gamergate the reason why Trump got elected. And as funny as it is to say that, the internet, and especially the corner of the internet that this Gamergate saga took place in, is not as important as people think. Again, not to minimize any of the harm experienced by the people, but it is obviously just internet BS at the end of the day. I'm a pretty online person, but I'm not going to stand here and make it seem like Gamergate was the most important event in human history. And while it's a lot less sexy to talk about, the hard right shift of Facebook boomers and the way that they took the rest of the conservative establishment with them is much more important to any story about American politics. But what is true is the extent to which Trump would weaponize both of these shifts to propel himself to new heights of American politics. What Trump was able to do was take advantage of the opportunity that others within the Republican establishment were busy trying to deny. If you remember back to the 2016 presidential primaries, you'll recall that mainstream politicians who were running against the Orange Man were extremely critical of him. I think about people like Ted Cruz, who held much of the same constituency as Trump, but were a relatively safe pick for the Republican establishment. Cruz actually got in a lot of trouble over his speech at the 2016 RNC for not explicitly endorsing Trump. And then there were also people like the Lincoln Project, who gained prominence in the resistance liberal era for being Republicans who had aggressively attacked Trump and made the rounds doing MSNBC interviews about it. Before Trump actually won the election, many people were already wondering whether or not the alliance between these two corners of the Republican Party could stand together. And for many, the nomination of Trump was proof that they couldn't do this anymore. People thought that Donald Trump had no chance in beating Hillary Clinton. But as we all know, he did actually win the 2016 election, and by quite a wide margin at that. So if you're a big business Republican at this time, over the course of a night, you went from, how are we going to stop this rabid contagion of the Republican Party, to, damn, we can really turn up the rhetoric dial and get away with it. But when you play stupid games, you win stupid prizes. And what happened next, I think they didn't really see coming.
10 o'clock Friday night, hundreds of white nationalists storming the University of Virginia, protesting plans to remove a statue of Confederate General Robert E. Lee.
On many sides. On many sides.
From the very beginning, Trump's candidacy was playing with fire. What Trump was able to do was ignite the dark underbelly of the Republican Party and embolden them to take increasingly bold actions. And this is why Charlottesville was able to take place at all. That night, the flame burned a little bit too bright. Literally. And all of a sudden, this stuff became very unfunny. Even just looking back at the footage of this event, it is severely unsettling, even for most Republicans, I suspect. It's a sort of black and white issue. When a bunch of white supremacists are holding up tiki torches chanting, "You will not replace us," all of a sudden, it's really uncomplicated. And maybe for the first time in American history, there was a sort of multiracial, multi-coalition backlash against conservative rule within this country. And the reason why I say multiracial is because Black Americans have always been at the forefront of fighting back against the capitalist, white supremacist, patriarchal, hegemonic superstructure that is dominant within Western society. Additionally, most of the actual organizing was carried about by people of color who were operating at the grassroots level, and it would be unfair not to recognize that. But anyway, 2 years later, the 2018 elections would deliver both the House and the Senate to Democrats, as well as major progressive victories in the form of the Squad. And later on, the 2022 elections, Joe Biden would win back a lot of the constituencies that Trump had picked up in the 2016 election. Most notably of these groups were suburban white women who were very much so traditional conservatives, but were turned off by the sort of shenanigans that the Trump right had been getting up to. And on top of that, the midterms of 2022 would be a disaster for the Republican Party, as they were largely held down by the issue of abortion and, again, a lot of the shenanigans of the far right. And so all that basically takes us to where we are right now. I skipped a lot of recent stuff, but we made it. Yay. But it's important to see the pattern that took place between the 1970s and now, so we can make predictions about the future of American politics moving forward. The modern conservative movement, the Reagan coalition, or whatever you want to call it, has always been underpinned by a reactionary backlash to all things that don't fit within a narrow vision of a Christian America. And just like Drake, the Republican tastemakers constantly need to be releasing new hits to keep the crowd engaged with the program. We've already went over the reactionary backlash of the 70s, But the 90s saw the same dynamic as a result of the Clinton years. Women were continuing to make advances in the workplace, immigration increased, and there was a decline in traditional family values.
I did not have sexual relations with that woman.
This decade saw the original rise of Fox News with hosts like Laura Ingraham, who are still at it. It also had the rise of people like Pat Robertson, Pat Buchanan, and Rush Limbaugh. And it's always the same group of people behind the scenes orchestrating this right-wing backlash. Paul Weyrich, the guy who founded the Heritage Foundation in the 1970s, had this to say in a letter addressed to the National Center for Public Policy Research. It is impossible to ignore the fact that the United States is becoming an ideological state. The ideology of political correctness, which openly calls for the destruction of our traditional culture, has so gripped the body politic, has so gripped our institutions, that it is even affecting the church. It has completely taken over the academic community, it is now pervasive in the entertainment industry, and it threatens to control literally every aspect of our lives. These words could have been said in the 70s, they could have been said in the 2010s, and they sit just as well here in the 1970s. The nature of the backlash never changes, it only adapts to the new technology it has access to. And at this point, the machine has gotten so far out of hand that no single person has the power to stop it. People don't have ideas. Ideas have people. And at a certain point, Republican tastemakers completely lost control of the narrative, allowing MAGA to sort of live outside of any one individual. Even people like Trump couldn't stop the backlash to the vaccine, despite the fact that he was the one who was responsible for getting it out so quickly through Operation Warp Speed. And while the result is usually Republican victories, the irony of the situation for right-wing populists is that they never actually win the things that they are promised. The only real victory I can think of is the overturning of Roe v. Wade, and this is definitely a big deal. But as far as batting averages go, that's not a particularly good one considering a half-century of conservative rule. In terms of actual legislative accomplishments, Trump was just another standard-issue Republican, only passing corporate tax cuts and renegotiating, but not really, NAFTA or the North American Free Trade Agreement. I think one of the biggest things that we can take away from this whole saga, from everything we've laid out in this video, is that Republicans who are interested in tax cuts and austerity politics, who are interested in neoliberal economics, they are the ones who always win. And whatever it takes to win, they're going to find a way to do that. And over the past 50 years, the best way to get that implemented has been through mobilizing sort of far-right elements of really unsavory parts of America. But they never actually win what they want. Those groups of people, they never win what they want. Social progress still continues to be made. But the thing is, it just keeps everybody in a worse state because we all have to deal with the consequences of this neoliberal economy that we've been subjected to since the 80s. Okay, let's wrap this thing up. So the great alliance between social conservatives and fiscal conservatives in the 1970s was one of the most powerful political forces in all of US history. And while the analysis of the phenomenon can be taken back all the way to the end of the Civil War, the so-called Lost Cause, and the rise of the original reactionary group, the Ku Klux Klan, I think that understanding the way that the conservative backlash in the 1970s still shapes the late-stage capitalist hellhole we all seem to be living in can give us some really strong framework for finding the best way out of this mess. As of right now, it seems very clear to me that this alliance is beginning to crack. The Republican Party is suffering immensely because of the fringe positions that many of its members are taking. Whether it's election denialism or abortion, the far-right Republicans have become a massive liability. Will they continue to be a liability moving forward, or will they go back to being a really strong asset? Well, only time can tell, but what I think we can say for sure is that this alliance is not the force that it used to be. Which is why it's going to be really embarrassing if Joe Biden doesn't win in 2024. While it gets pessimistic at times, this story is ultimately a story of hope, or at least I want it to be. While people like the Koch brothers and Joseph Coors might have ungodly sums of money to throw at astroturfed political movements and amplify the craziest voices on the internet, they lack two pieces for a successful political movement. They don't have popular support, and they certainly don't have the facts on their side. Even though the rise of the evangelical right in the late 60s might remind you of reactionary movements today, what it also reminds me of is the continuous rise of the left. We are building the same networks of media, we're organizing for the things that we believe in, and we're slowly building up at least a little bit of institutional power. Despite being controlled by conservative leadership for the past 50 years, the United States isn't an intrinsically conservative place, and big change is possible. If the conservative movement can flash into existence in the blink of an eye, so can a progressive future. The age of neoliberalism and conservatism is coming to an end. Old alliances are fading into the past. People are seeing through old economic ideas and are willing to try new ones. The sun will once again shine on Gondor. I mean, America. Let's bring this back to Earth. So get a friend out to the polls with you, volunteer with a local candidate, stand up for social and economic justice when it's called upon you, and never lose hope. The future belongs to us. All we have to do is take it. My name is Pray for Enemy. Thank you for your time.